Hello and welcome to the Survey Your Podcast. Here you will find stories, interviews and interesting discussions about how the good news of Jesus Christ is being shared with the peoples of East Asia. I'm your host Ryan.
And I'm Kat. In this season, we are looking at the role technology plays in the Great Commission.
And this is our first ever episode, which we're really excited about.
In this episode, we interview Joelle, who works in the jungles of Cambodia through radio ministry.
In this interview with Joelle, we talk about how radio technology is used by God for the gospel in rural Cambodia, among many other interesting topics as well. Without further ado, we're just going to go straight into the interview. Joelle, thank you so much for agreeing to come on to the podcast. Could you tell our audience a little bit about yourself, what you've been up to?
Yeah, so my name is Joelle Kenny and I joined OMF in 2013, I think. I'm a single missionary and I've been serving in northeast Cambodia. So that's in a province called Ratanakiri. And in Ratanakiri, 90% of the population are actually tribal people. I think there's around 10 to 12 different tribes. And there have been OMF mission partners there working particularly among the Krung tribe and the Bro. So the tribal people are farmers, they're subsistence farmers, so they're farming mostly to feed themselves, maybe sell a little bit of their crops just to earn a little bit of extra cash. And they're animist people, so they worship evil spirits, and they're living in constant fear of those spirits because they believe that those spirits have an ability to harm them. And so their way of trying to control and appease these evil spirits is by performing animal sacrifices, which they still do today.
We're currently recording on a really lovely summer's day in Brighton. Mm-hmm. We can see the coast from where we've just been.
Yeah.
How is this where you grew up in Brighton?
Actually, it's not. My mother moved here about 12 years ago. So when I come back home from being overseas, this is the home that I come back to now. Yeah.
So it must be quite a contrast coming from what you just described, working amongst tribal peoples to being here.
That's right. They're hill tribe people. It's a jungle environment, little villages scattered throughout the hills, very bad roads, very muddy. So driving out there is probably actually one of the most stressful things for me. Driving out to the villages on those bad roads, I'm really depending on God to get me there safely and back home safely. Yeah.
So what have you yourself been up to in Cambodia?
Yeah, so I have 3 areas of ministry that I'm involved with. So one is youth work among the Krung tribe. The other is women's ministry, so Bible studies for women out in the villages, among the Krung. But I've also been involved in some radio work. So just as I was arriving in Ratanakiri, they were starting a daily radio show that was going to go out to the tribal people. And because I was arriving, just as they were starting, they said, hey, is this one of the things that you'd like to be involved with? So that was a surprise to me. It was unexpected, but I've actually really loved being involved in the radio work.
So what inspired the radio work?
Yeah, so good question. I actually had very little to do with it. I can't really take any credit, to be honest. 2 OMF couples had been working among the tribes in Ratanakiri for many years before I arrived. It had always been their dream to start a Christian daily radio show in the local tribal languages. I don't know why it took so long to get off the ground because they'd already been there for 20 years. But when it did get off the ground, I think their idea was basically, firstly, for it to reach the most isolated villages with the gospel. So that, those hard to reach places that missionaries are not able to get to regularly because the roads are too bad, or simply villages that we haven't even discovered yet, that we could still reach them with the gospel through the airwaves. But also, secondly, I think the point of the radio show was to actually spiritually feed the tribal people that had already become Christians. So most tribal people are illiterate. Most of their languages are not even written, so they can't pick up a Bible and read or study it for themselves to feed themselves spiritually. So by creating the show, that was going to be broadcast every evening, at 7:00. These Christian families would be able to tune in for the slot that was in their language, maybe after eating their evening meal, and be taught faithfully from God's word.
That's amazing, yeah.
That's really cool. So what is the culture with these tribal people? What is the culture of radio? How do they use radio? Like what type of technology?
Radio is actually really popular because out in the villages, they don't have electricity. But they do have mobile phones, which they charge on their motorbikes or on car batteries. But on their phones, they have radio. And when they're out farming in the fields, quite often they will be listening to the radio on their mobile phone. But also when the radio show was set up, we did promote the show out in the villages, saying, look, this is a radio show that's going to be broadcast at this time in your own heart language. But we were also selling radios as we were going around promoting it. And radio sales just rocketed. We managed to find these really good, cheap radios that were really sturdy and hardworthy, battery operated, and just sell them really cheaply. So they sold like hotcakes.
So have you got any stories you can tell us about how God's used this radio ministry?
Yeah, there are actually many stories, but I guess I'm going to share one with you. Around about a year ago, we were contacted by a family who had been listening to our radio show. They were from the Joelle tribe, so we have 20 minutes of the show is in the Joelle language. They'd been listening to the show for about 6 months, and they called us and they said, look, we're really interested in becoming followers of Jesus, but we don't actually know any other Christians among our villages. We've never met a Christian before. We don't really know what to do or how to become a Christian. Can you help us? So Tom, who is Joelle himself, he had been volunteering at the radio studios when we received that phone call. And he said, well, let's try and find out where they are and I'll go and visit them. So he in his own time found that family, which I think wasn't an easy thing to do. It was a village that he hadn't personally known about. But when he found them, he simply opened up the Bible with them and began studying God's word with them, because Tom himself is actually literate. And he continued to make trips out to that family whenever he could to continue teaching them the Bible. And as he made those trips out to the village, other people in the villages were thinking, well, who is this man? Why does he come on a regular basis? And what's he doing when he goes into that home? And the last I heard is that 50 people now gather to listen to Tom teaching from the Bible from that village. I don't know if any of those other people listening have become Christians. I haven't necessarily heard that. But he has a good audience and people are hearing God's word. And the original family that, of course, phoned in, they have become baptized. They have become true believers. And we managed to find another Christian family that actually weren't too far from them. So those two families now meet up on a Sunday morning together to have worship.
So not only are people being introduced to Jesus through radio, but it's opening the door for discipleship and opening the door to plant churches and make a Christian community in these tribes.
Yeah. So we really encourage people to phone in and let us know if they're interested. And we try to meet them personally and see what we, can do to help them get connected with other Christians in the area, or to start a Bible study in their home so that they can become small churches. Yeah.
That's wonderful, because one of the key theme that we want to explore during this season of our podcast is, what role does technology have to play in God's kingdom? And just these stories that you're talking about just shows how God can take something that a piece of technology that's been developed by humans, and he uses it to build his kingdom, to see people coming to Christ, and to not only see people just hear the gospel, but actually also seeing people grow in their faith as well. And then also seeing them not just hear it and that's it, but actually you're seeing real genuine connections happen as well, because you encourage them to phone in and then you establish that relationship.
Yeah.
So are you finding that you're able to reach people that you just otherwise would never have been able to reach?
Absolutely. That has been the great thing about the radio show, is it helps us to enter new villages which we hadn't been able to do work in before. And actually there's one village that had been hostile for many years. So missionaries had gone to it, tried to work with people in that village, tried to share the gospel with them, but they were told to leave. However, so I think for many years, missionaries kind of gave up on that village. But now that village have been tuning in, they've been hearing the radio show and hearts have been softened. And now we have people in that village who are saying, can you guys come and teach us? Wow. So it allows us to enter villages where previously they'd been hostile and told us to leave, or just new villages that we didn't even know existed.
That's amazing.
It's wonderful. It's really encouraging to hear.
Yeah.
Some stories from actually what's going on outside of just our UK context, but what God is doing in all over the world, but specifically in this context that you've been working in.
Well, of course, I think the radio has a long-standing history of mission among tribal people, particularly because they're illiterate. You can't just go into the villages and hand out tracts and Bibles. That's not going to work. They're going to be able to need to hear the gospel, and the airwaves is just a great way of them being able to hear it on a regular basis and get familiar with what the gospel is and what Christians believe.
So earlier when we were setting up, you kind of talked about how Christians are maintaining tribal culture through music and dress. And is the radio involved in that in any way?
Well, I just think Christianity among tribal people, full stop, not necessarily. Well, actually, no, you're right. Through the radio, we are helping keep the tribal cultures, because all of the music on our radio show is the traditional kind of tribal music that they're used to. So gong playing, or among the Joelle, they do use the guitar, but they tune the guitar differently to how we do in the West. So actually, we go out and we go to the villages, we record their traditional music, and we then bring that back to the studio. We use that music, but we set Christian words to it instead of the original animist words. And so we're creating new music using the traditional instruments that they use, and then playing them on the radio. Yeah, so people are getting used to the same tunes that they knew, but now also with Christian words. And so learning the gospel through their traditional music. But one criticism of missionaries doing tribal work is that we destroy their culture and we make them Western. But actually, it's been very different. It's been the exact opposite, actually, to where we are in Ratanakiri. So it's actually the tribal Christians that are keeping all the traditional music going. So in the church services on a Sunday morning are using all the traditional gongs. They're the ones that are continuing to use the traditional outfits. It's actually the non-Christian tribal people that are moving away from the culture, if anything, because they're the ones that are beginning to listen to like modern pop music and things like that. But so it's been the opposite for us, which we're really proud of.
One thing I want to hear more about is what was your journey into mission? How did you end up being in Cambodia doing this? Was it like you had a sense of like God spoke to you audibly at one point, go to Cambodia, or was it a bit more nuanced?
It was a bit more straightforward than that, actually, and a bit more sort of commonsensical. Okay. I don't know if that's a word. But before I became a missionary, I was an art teacher. I went to teach at a school in India for 3 years, a mission school called Ep1. Had a wonderful time there. Came back to England and continued working here for a few years, and then got the itch to go overseas and teach again. So I found a Christian school in Cambodia that was looking for an art teacher. Decided I would go and teach there for a year, but ended up staying for 3 years. Now, the reason I ended up staying for 3 years was that during that time, I started going to a Cambodian church, not an international church, a Cambodian church, where I made lots of Cambodian friends outside of school. And with one Cambodian friend in particular, we started a Bible study for her non-Christian neighbours. So every Sunday afternoon, she would bring her non-Christian neighbours to her home, and I would teach them the Bible through a translator. I couldn't speak the local language. But that Bible study lasted 3 years, and we saw a whole family become Christians through that Bible study. And I just remember thinking, do you know what? I can't think of anything better to do with the rest of my life than teach the Bible to Cambodians. It's just brought me so much joy. And particularly seeing this family become Christians just brought me so much joy. I just thought, wow, wouldn't it be wonderful to just do this full time? So anyway, my contract finished at the school. I went back to England, and I shared this idea with my home church. You know, I'm thinking of possibly becoming a missionary in Cambodia, where I can be mostly involved in Bible teaching. And, you know, they were really supportive, and they helped me get the Bible training that I needed to go back. And I think because, you know, my church was so supportive and thought it was a great idea, and all the doors kind of opened for me to return to Cambodia as a missionary, I just thought, yeah, this seems to be God's confirmation that this is his will for me.
Sure. So you had an experience of sharing the gospel in a cross-cultural way, and that just gave you a burning passion, like this is what I want to spend my life doing.
Yeah. So I couldn't even speak the language. I was just doing it through a translator. But still, just that connection I had with this family who were really enjoying studying the Bible, were really fully engaged, asking great questions, and then seeing them come through to faith. I thought, wow, this is must be the best job in the world, just teaching the Bible to people from another culture. And of course, now I've gone back, I've learned the language, so I'm not doing anything through translators anymore. And so it's even better.
How long did that take for you to learn language and understand the culture in a way in which you felt confident to kind of engage people on your own?
So I've been studying the language now for 4.5 years. I wouldn't say I'm fluent. I can just about teach a simple Bible study. There's still, lots I've got to learn, but, I seem to be able to make myself understood. And we can study the Bible, although it's, very simply with me using the local language. But I think, once you start learning a language, it's a lifelong thing. I don't think you ever feel that you've got to a point where you're fluent. I think it's just, it's just continuous learning, and it's just going to be a lifelong plugging away at trying to get better and better at the language and have greater and greater depth. Yeah. It's through learning a language that you actually get to know the culture. So, local proverbs, how a language is used, their vocabulary actually gives great insight to that culture and what that culture values and highly prizes. So, for example, eating and food is a very important part of Cambodian culture. So they'll have many, many words to describe for the word eat, to eat. They'll have many, many words for the word food because it's just a really big part of their culture.
I see.
Yeah. And, local proverbs are a great insight into the culture as well. So one proverb is a smashed egg cannot be put back together again. And that's basically talking about how when a relationship has been destroyed or broken, it's broken forever.
Oh, wow.
And that's an insight into the fact that culture doesn't have a culture of forgiveness.
Wow. Okay.
They think that once a relationship is broken, it's over and it can't be mended. So, going in as a Christian, sort of actually saying, actually, the egg, with God's help, the egg can be put back together again. It doesn't have to be that way. There is something called forgiveness. Let us share that with you. Yeah.
So that proverb, is that something that you would even consider using in your witness to say, you say in your own language, a smashed egg cannot be put back together, but actually, do you actually use it as a form of a tool for witnessing?
Yeah, so we can include, so I think when Christianity is saying actually, that proverb that you have isn't true, it's a good way in to say, well, this is what you guys say, but let me now teach you what the Bible says. Yeah, about relationships and how it can be different with God's help. Yeah.
Do you ever talk about that in the radio? Use proverbs and then...
Do you know what? I don't think we have done that, and I think that would be a really good idea. So thank you for the idea.
So what is the structure of the radio show? How long is it? Are there specific segments that you guys do? And Yeah, good question. So the show lasts for 1 hour and 20 minutes, and it's split up into 4 20-minute blocks, and each 20-minute block is in a different tribal language. So the tribes will know, exactly what time their 20-minute block starts. So that's when they'll tune in and be ready for the 20 minutes that's in their own heart language. And the show consists of testimonies. So we quite often go out to villages and record testimonies of tribal people who have become Christians. It involves a lot of traditional tribal music, but with Christian lyrics. It involves reading from scripture in their own heart language. It involves role play and dramas. And sometimes it's just a simple sermon that's been recorded from a Sunday church service and is put out on the airwaves. So quite a variety, And each 20-minute slot has its own producer. So, for example, the Jarai slot will have a Jarai producer, and the Krung slot will have a Krung producer. So this show is being made by the local tribal people. It's actually not being made by foreigners. That's really cool.
So they're doing all the hard work, really, and us missionaries are just kind of mostly supporting and supervising.
So is it the same sermon just in different languages, or is it a different sermon?
No, it's not. So each 20-minute slot is its own unique program. So, the Jorai producer is going to know what Jorai people are interested in and what things they like to hear. So he's going to make his own unique Jorai 20-minute program. And the same for the Krung, and then the same for the Pro. So, for example, the Jorai people are really into music. They're probably the most musical out of all of the tribal people in Ratanakiri. So in the Jorai 20-minute slot, there's a lot of music because they love it, because that's what they're interested in. So, but in the Krung 20-minute slot, they're much more into sort of drama and role play. So that would be, a big component of their unique program. Yeah,
that's cool. I love it how it's local people making Christian radio for their own tribe.
Yeah.
I think just hearing the way in which you've structured this radio program just shows like the work that needs to go into contextualizing the gospel, because they say what one tribe will be more music focused and one tribe will be more focused on stories and drama.
Yes.
And so that just makes me think about like how you have to do hard work, don't you, to figure out how does a...
Well, because the producer comes from that tribe himself or herself, we've actually got a female producer now. She knows what her own tribe is into. She knows what they like listening to, what they want on the radio. So he or she can tailor make it their 20 minutes for their own tribe. Yeah.
So this highlights how it's really important to make sure that the gospel doesn't seem like a foreign thing.
This is so important. So, for example, if a British Christian radio show was just purely translated into one of the tribal languages, it is not going to connect, at all. These are tribal people who live in the jungle. They are farmers, and they need a radio show that is including farming illustrations and that is a life that they see around them every day and that they can relate to. It can't be something picked up in London and just translated. It just wouldn't work.
Yeah.
It wouldn't resonate with them.
That's such a clear example of how the Bible is for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's not just for the West. It's for every nation.
Yeah. And actually some parts of the Bible have come more alive to me since I've been working with tribal people than they ever did back here in the West. So just studying something like the Book of Ruth with my tribal women, that whole story, that whole book came alive to me in a way that it never did when I was living here, because it's so much about, a kind of rural community and farming. And there we are sitting, next to a rice field with farmers studying that story. And it just came alive to me in a really precious way. Yeah.
I guess so much of the Gospels, Jesus is using parables in a time where he's using farming illustrations and fishing illustrations.
Yeah.
And so it's not a case of we're an enlightened Western missionary who's going to go along and teach everyone everything, but actually you're going to this place and learning more about
I'm the one who's learning more. Yeah. So actually, when I study the parables with the Krung youth, the tribal youth, they get the parables a lot quicker than I do.
Really?
I have to sit down and really work out what a parable, that Jesus told really means. I have to really study it hard, whereas they just get it immediately because it's usually sort of in a rural sort of context, farming context that they're used to, and they understand a lot better than I do.
What's the advice you would give to people in the UK to learn more about mission, or if they're interested in mission, either in the local context or global context?
Yeah. I think if you are interested in going overseas, I think just do something short term to get started. So, for example, there was a single lady who came and lived with me in Ratanakiri for 1 year. She was open to the possibility of becoming a missionary. She came and stayed for 1 year, and afterwards she decided she didn't want to be a missionary, and that was absolutely fine. But it was really great that she just gave it a shot, came on something short term, and it's that now ruled out for her. But it's good that she discovered that, And of course, for other people, it's the exact opposite. They do something short term, and then they feel like, yeah, this is a life I can really see myself doing, and obviously take it further.
We hope you enjoyed the interview, because we certainly did. Ryan, what was your biggest takeaway?
There were a lot of things to take away from the interview. I feel we covered so many different things. I think one of the things I was most struck by was how, by her going to Cambodia, it wasn't the case that she was going there and she knew everything, and she was just there just to teach and not to receive. But actually, how her going to Cambodia was actually a way of her receiving, her like getting to understand certain Bible stories in a deeper way that she'd never would have been able to understand just by being in the UK, and how she's learning from those that she is sharing the gospel with as well. I think that's just I thought that was wonderful, and it just shows that mission isn't just this one-way street, but actually mission is something that goes in all sorts of directions.
I really loved how they had that one tribe that was off on their own, and they had missionaries go before, but they just didn't. They had missionaries go before, and they didn't like the missionaries going. But then after they heard the radio in their own language, their hearts softened, and they were much more open to people coming and sharing the gospel with them. So it was the radio that they heard first, and it was the radio and the people on the radio that softened their hearts.
Yeah, which links to this verse in Isaiah 52, which in verse 7 it says, "How beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of him who brings good news, who publishes peace, who brings good news of happiness, who publishes salvation." So in this verse, it's talking about the feet of those who bring the good news, and this verse is referenced in New Testament and Romans as well, about how people need to walk to different places, they need to go to different places to share the gospel, but actually how by using radio technology they're actually able to reach people that they just physically couldn't get to with their feet, but they can get to them with the radio waves, and then that then leads to those real face-to-face relationships. So it's amazing to hear how radio technology is opening up opportunities for the gospel.
Definitely a blessing.
We hope you've enjoyed listening to this episode of the Serve Asia podcast. If you have any questions, feedback, or anything else, then we would love to hear from you. You can get in touch by emailing uk.podcast@omfmail.com. Alternatively, you could send us a direct message on Instagram @ServeAsiaPodcast. If you'd like to support the podcast, then do share it with anyone you know who has a heart for sharing Jesus cross-culturally. And also, a 5-star review on iTunes goes a long way as well. Thanks for listening, and see you on the next episode.